President Donald Trump's favorite economic tool is tariffs.
Trump announced that he would slap major new tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China.
I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich.
Tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
Tariff.
Tariffs. Tariffs.
Tariffs. Tariffs will make our country rich.
But Trump's love for tariffs is having a profound impact on three major U.S. trading partners. Mexico, Canada, and China are all major trading partners of the U.S. But Canada seems to be in the closest line of fire. Trump announced in the Oval Office that he wants to impose tariffs of 25% on Mexico and Canada. The new United States leader said he would implement these tariffs on February 1. Other areas that could feel the effects of Mr. Trump's directives include immigration, energy, and electric vehicles. However, Canada could impose retaliatory tariffs in response to Mr. Trump's move. The Canadian side is preparing to launch plans to retaliate against the United States for its decision to reduce oil exports. The nuclear option in Canada's arsenal of possible responses to Trump's tariffs is the threat to suspend, reduce, or impose export tariffs on Canadian energy. The mere suggestion of such a tactic has led to a split between the Alberta government and the governments of Canada and other provinces. Tariffs on imports from the United States have the potential to hurt some sectors and regions. However, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has acknowledged that the impact of Canada's import tariffs will be diminished by the size of the United States population and economy. On the other hand, halting or tariffing Canada's resource exports has the potential to cause real and general discomfort in the United States. But it would also impose huge costs on Canada. Sanjay Jairam, a senior lecturer in political science at Simon Fraser University, said he hoped the threat idea would do most of the heavy lifting. But Jairam argues that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's stance, which opens the door to the Trump administration's divide and rule policy, weakens Canada's position. Jairam also points out that this division within the country may increase the likelihood that Trump will realise that Canada really cannot sustain this division and may be more willing to wait. For him, the real problem is in showing the division. However, there is reason to believe that Canada's strongest leverage in a trade war is not what it will avoid buying, but what it will avoid selling. Lawrence Herman, an international trade lawyer and former Canadian diplomat, says oil is not the only resource card Canada holds. Lawrence Herman points to the willingness of many northern provinces to cut off electricity exports on which they are heavily dependent. Unless the United States exempts crude oil from its general tariffs on Canadian imports, such a step would be pointless for Canada, Herman said. In his view, there is no need to even think about export restrictions in this context. Herman believes that tariffs on potassium, critical minerals, steel, and aluminum will also put pressure on the new administration. These are among the elements that United States industries rely on to integrate with Canadian producers. Could not refineries replace Canadian imports with crude from other countries? To answer this question, it is important to understand how the United States refining sector became dependent on Canadian crude in the first place. An important fact is that while the country is vulnerable to Canadian oil disruptions, it is not because it does not produce enough oil for its own needs. It is important to remember that Canada produces more than it needs and is a net exporter. For the United States, the problem arises in the conversion of all this crude oil production into usable gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. The United States has around 130 refineries with the capacity to refine more than 18 million barrels of oil per day. But there is a mismatch between these refineries and the type of oil the United States produces. In the 1980s and 90s, there were widespread fears that oil was running out. United States production was falling, and so the refining industry redesigned itself to be able to process Latin American oil, mainly from Venezuela. Venezuela has the world's largest known oil reserves. Most of it is bitumen-heavy crude, which is difficult to refine and difficult to get through pipelines unless it is diluted, just like the oil sands in Alberta. Then, early in this century, new technologies such as horizontal drilling led to a United States oil boom in Texas fields such as the Permian and Eagle Ford, and in North Dakota's Bakken. The shale oil produced in these fields is lighter and sweeter than Venezuelan or Canadian crude and has less sulfur, and therefore theoretically easier to refine. But many refineries had invested in expensive technology designed to process heavy crude, and their business models depended on the price discount they demanded for such oil, which sold for a few dollars less than a barrel of light, sweet crude. Much of the United States shale oil began to be exported to overseas refineries that were better suited to process it. United States crude exports have grown from less than 1 million barrels per month in 2009 to well over 100 million barrels per month today. The United States has also continued to import foreign heavy oil. The rise of the Chavez regime in Venezuela in 1999 led to an exodus of petroleum engineers and a massive decline in oil production, upsetting the long-term plans of the United States refining industry. Canadian oil sands production was rising at the same time as Venezuela's was falling. The next quarter century would see the proliferation of pipelines and transportation networks in the United States designed to refine heavy Canadian crude. Many refineries, especially in the Midwest and West, are completely dependent on Canadian imports. If Canada turns off or tightens the taps or simply raises the price, these refineries could theoretically source similar heavy oil from other suppliers. In practice, however, both political and economic considerations would make this difficult. In November 2022, the United States government eased sanctions against Venezuela and Chevron returned to the country. But this relaxation was conditional on Nicolas Maduro allowing democratic elections. The Biden administration began withdrawing licenses in 2024 as it became clear that Maduro had no intention of allowing a free and fair vote, and today very little oil is flowing. Now, according to experts, Donald Trump could lift the sanctions altogether and allow Venezuelan crude to flow once again to United States refineries. But there are important reasons to believe that Trump will not do so. Living in Florida, Trump probably understands the importance of MAGAzuelans and other anti-communist Latino voters for his winning coalition in the state. It is also hard to imagine that Trump's new Secretary of State, the Cuban-American Marco Rubio, would want to start by lifting sanctions against the Maduro regime. And in any case, Venezuela's makeshift industry is seen as a mere shadow of what it was before the socialist takeover. Venezuela produces a total of less than 1 million barrels a day, most of which has already been promised to China. For the United States, Venezuela's daily production can never replace the 4 million barrels a day that Canada exports to the country. So we can see that there is no viable alternative in this situation. But can Canada diversify its trade outside the United States? Canada can reduce its dependence on the United States by diversifying its trading partners. Building stronger ties with emerging economies and expanding exports to alternative markets would strengthen Canada's bargaining position with the United States. However, diversification is not as easy as it sounds. Canada is unlikely to significantly diversify its trade relations in the short term. Replacing Canada's exports to the United States with other foreign markets will take time due to decades of interconnected trade agreements and shared infrastructure built to facilitate trade between the two countries. For now, the most practical approach is for Canada to avoid or reduce punitive tariffs by focusing on negotiations with the United States. A 25% increase would make Canadian exports too expensive for Americans, could hurt the Canadian economy, and could also hurt American businesses. There is a possibility that Trump could use tariffs as a bargaining chip to get Canada to make more concessions. However, Canadian-American interdependence allows Canada to argue that maintaining strong bilateral trade is mutually beneficial. Canada's long-term path to economic resilience lies in deeper engagement with other global markets. As a member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, Canada can expand trade with countries such as Australia, Brunei, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. The success of Mexico's trade diversification offers Canada a valuable lesson. Between 2016 and 2023, bilateral trade between Mexico and China grew from $42.6 billion to to $100.22 billion. Trade volumes more than doubled with year-on-year growth. The Canadian government could follow this path by entering into trade agreements with other economies outside the United States. Such agreements give Canadian exporters market access in other countries while opening Canada to imports from those countries. This approach not only diversifies trade partnerships, but also has the potential to lower inflation by offering cheaper imports. Canada could also take inspiration from Singapore, which maintains strong economic ties with both the United States and China by remaining neutral and refusing to take sides. As trade tensions between the United States and China escalate, Canada has an opportunity to position itself as a similar peacemaker. Similarly, forging trade ties with China and other emerging economies, such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, offers tremendous opportunities for Canada and long-term export growth. ASEAN members include Brunei, Burma, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. In total, ASEAN countries have a GDP of over $4 trillion and a population of 647 million, making them among the fastest-growing economies in the world. While much of the Western world is trending away from globalization and towards economic fragmentation, emerging economies are increasingly interconnected and integrated into the global economy. Canada should therefore seize the opportunity to engage effectively with these markets. Canada is well positioned to strengthen trade ties with emerging economies. Canada has several natural advantages, including abundant natural resources, a highly educated and skilled population, and good institutions. While Canada cannot immediately reduce its dependence on United States trade, it must lay the foundations for a more resilient and diversified economy. By expanding its trade relations with emerging markets, Canada can strengthen its economic position and reduce its exposure to the vagaries of American trade policy. So, what is behind the strained relations between Canada and the United States? United States President-elect Donald Trump has reiterated his desire to make Canada the 51st American state and announced Canadian entrepreneur Kevin O'Leary's support for the idea in a social media post. Trump has been ridiculed for his recent trolling of Canada, but at a time when the country's long-weakened Liberal government is falling apart following Chrystia Freeland's resignation as Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, Trump's sudden behaviour seems dangerous. In her resignation letter in December, Freeland centred her criticism of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the country's response to Trump. Among the many criticisms of her former boss, a recurring theme was that Canada was not ready to face the new threat posed by Trump's second term. Trump wasted no time meddling in Canada's internal affairs, calling Freeland toxic and continuing his running joke of referring to Trudeau as the governor of an American state rather than the leader of a sovereign nation. The attacks are becoming routine. In another post, Trump implied that Canadians would save a lot of money on taxes and military protection as the 51st state. Canada will have to figure out how to deal with Trump and the existential threat he poses to Canada much more effectively than the Liberals did under Trudeau. Trump blatantly disrespects Canadian independence and with it Canadian identity. He is openly challenging the idea of Canadian sovereignty. Canada must respond accordingly. It can be difficult to fully understand the nature and scope of the threats posed by someone so willing to disregard respected political and diplomatic conventions. His annexation threats pose a constant series of multifaceted challenges to Canada's economic prosperity, democratic norms, and sovereignty. The economic dimension of his threat to Canada is now well known. Trump's proposal to impose a 25% tariff on all Canadian exports to the United States would be incredibly costly for both countries, given the integration of their economies. But given the difference in size between the two countries, the impact in Canada will be greater. The democratic threat is also clear. Trump has shown that he does not see democracy as a vital set of rules and norms, but as a set of obstacles to be overcome. He is unable to accept defeat or even welcome victory with grace. The revenge tour has begun. Lawsuits have been filed against media outlets and even against an opinion pollster who, in the last days of the United States election campaign, revealed data showing Democrat Kamala Harris leading. Back in the White House, Trump has promised to use public institutions to punish opponents. Last year, a partisan United States Supreme Court ruling guaranteed that he would remain immune from prosecution, even if his own actions were criminal. Trump's disrespect for democratic institutions is corrosive and contagious. During his first term, experts sounded alarm bells about how he was associated with democratic backsliding around the world. If the United States president can openly challenge democratic norms, what is to stop other would-be demagogues from doing the same? A second Trump administration is likely to continue these trends, and his willingness to intervene in Canadian politics is sending shockwaves north of the border. Trump's actions have repeatedly implied that he has no respect for those he sees as powerless, and right now, Canada fits that description. He has made it a running joke that Canada is not a real country, just another American state. Laughing nervously at this threat is not enough as a response. So far, Canada has acted in a way that gives the impression that Trump is right. Instead of backing down, defending Canada's strong record in managing its part of the border relationship, the government immediately pledged more than $1 billion in new border spending. Canadian leaders failed to characterize Trump's threats as a bully's bluff. In the face of Trump's tariff threats, instead of following normal protocol and expecting an official state visit after his inauguration, Trudeau made a surprise trip to Florida to pay his respects to the president-elect and defend Canada's cause. In this case, it might be useful to think of Trump as a schoolyard bully and ask someone else to do his homework. In this case, defend America's borders. This kind of bullying doesn't end when you give in to the bully, but only when it is clear that you will not do so. Border protection is a fundamental function of every state and the responsibility of every American president. Trump's demand that others do it for him is both a sign of weakness and an attempt to create a scapegoat if his efforts fail. As with any bully, if you promise to work for him, you only encourage additional torture. So when Trudeau promised to do more in exchange for ending the bullying, he got a kick for his efforts when Trump started mocking him for being the governor of the 51st American state. The world is watching how Canada will respond to the bully. If Canada hopes to earn the respect of its peers, it must show that it is willing to fight for itself, its prosperity, and its values. It must defend its sovereignty against those who refuse to respect it and act assertively to protect Canadian prosperity. This could mean a trade war. For more than a century, Canada and the United States have found ways to cooperate and prosper side by side, despite the fact that the United States is a much more powerful country. They have built alliances and agreements based on shared norms, values, and traditions as part of a deep and multifaceted relationship. None of this history seems to matter to Trump, and now American power seems more important than Canadian sovereignty. This power imbalance is even more acute given Canada's dependence on the American economy and American military power. But Canada is not powerless. Dependence works both ways, and the deep integration of the two countries' economies also makes the US vulnerable. Stopping electricity exports, as Ontario Premier Doug Ford has proposed, is a course of action that would have an immediate and significant negative impact on the American economy. The same is true for oil. Energy is power in more ways than one. The US consumes millions of barrels of Canadian oil every day, and imposing a tax on this fuel would lead to inflation and would ultimately be unpopular with American voters. Other countries could also lose if the US gets away with disrespecting Canadian sovereignty. No country will be safe if Trump refuses to respect Canadian sovereignty. Panama and Denmark can already attest to this. For any country that values its independence, finding ways to creatively push back against such demands should be an imperative, and Canada needs to work with such allies. Thank you for tuning in.